There are moments that arrive with such precise timing that the word coincidence starts to feel too thin for what just happened. Someone you have not spoken to in years calls on the same evening you suddenly remember their face. A strange image appears 3 times in one day in places that seem to have nothing to do with each other, and then turns out to speak directly to a decision you have been unable to make. What matters is not whether such moments feel eerie. What matters is whether our usual explanation is actually strong enough to carry their weight. If they are only noise, why do they so often arrive with structure? If they are more than noise, then the problem is larger than psychology. It reaches into how we think about cause, time, mind, and the architecture of reality itself. This is where the subject becomes serious, not mystical, not theatrical. Serious, because the central question is not whether human beings enjoy telling stories about improbable events. Of course we do. The real question is whether a meaningful pattern can ever be real in a world that claims to run on blind mechanism. Modern scientific culture has been built with good reason on the power of causation. One thing pushes another. A signal travels, a force acts, a chain can be traced. That framework gave us engines, vaccines, electronic satellites, and particle accelerators. It deserves its authority. But the existence of a powerful framework does not guarantee that it captures every kind of order the world contains. Carl Jung used the word synchronicity for a very specific kind of event. Not any coincidence, not any surprise. He meant a coincidence that is both meaningful and not adequately explained by an ordinary chain of cause and effect. That definition is narrower than people often assume. It does not say that every repetition is cosmic. It does not say that every unlikely event contains a message. It says something more careful and therefore more unsettling. There may be cases where events are linked not by force but by meaning. That is the claim. And once stated clearly, it becomes difficult to dismiss without thinking much harder than people usually do. At first glance, the simplest response seems obvious. The brain is a pattern-making machine. It is built to detect regularities even when regularities are not really there. This is not a flaw, it is part of survival. A creature that notices the shape in the grass before confirming the snake has a better chance of living long enough to be wrong again tomorrow. The cost of missing a real pattern is often greater than the cost of inventing a false one. So we search, we connect, we impose shape on noise. That is one of the oldest facts about being human. And yet that explanation, true as far as it goes, leaves something unfinished. It explains why we are vulnerable to false meaning. It does not automatically explain why every experience of meaning must be false. That is the first intuition this video has to correct. Debunking an error mechanism is not the same as disproving every event that passes through it. Optical illusions exist. That does not mean vision is useless. False memories exist. That does not mean all memory collapses. The existence of pattern hunger is real. But the existence of pattern hunger alone does not settle the status of every pattern we encounter. Picture a long, dark hallway with motion sensors on both sides. Some lights switch on because someone is truly walking there. Others flicker because the system is too sensitive. If you discover that the sensors are imperfect, you have learned something important. But you have not proven the hallway is always empty. You have only learned that caution is necessary. That is the right tone for this subject, not surrender, not certainty, caution, precision, a willingness to separate what feels profound from what can survive scrutiny. That distinction matters because human experience contains 2 different layers that are often confused. The first is raw improbability. Strange things happen simply because enough things happen. In a large enough life, the unlikely is guaranteed to occur sometimes. The second layer is significance. An event does not become synchronistic merely because it is rare. It becomes disturbing when rarity and relevance converge. The coincidence does not just happen, it lands on an exposed nerve. It fits the psychological moment too well. It enters not as spectacle but as alignment. That alignment is what makes the subject difficult. We are not dealing only with numbers, we are dealing with numbers crossing into meaning. A phone call from a stranger is not the same as a phone call from the one person you were just thinking about after 10 silent years. The repeated appearance of a number means almost nothing by itself, but if it keeps surfacing at the edge of one unresolved decision, the experience changes shape. Data alone is not enough. Personal context enters the frame. And once personal context enters, the clean line between outer event and inner state becomes harder to maintain. This is also where the stakes become clear. Because if meaning is always added afterward by the observer, then synchronicity dissolves into a cognitive after effect. But if there are moments when meaning is not merely projected when it is somehow discovered, then the universe is less mechanically indifferent than modern habits of thought often assume. That would not prove destiny, it would not justify superstition, but it would force a revision. The world would remain lawful, yet perhaps not exhausted by the law in the narrow classical sense. Order might exist in more than one register. There is a reason this question keeps returning across centuries. Human beings have always sensed, at least intermittently, that some events arrive with a density that exceeds accident. Religions framed that intuition through providence. Philosophical traditions framed it through hidden order. Depth psychology framed it through symbolism and the unconscious. Contemporary skeptics frame it through selective attention and bias. None of these traditions should be accepted automatically, but the sheer recurrence of the intuition is itself worth noticing. The idea survives because experience keeps feeding it. Nauglet. Still, the honest place to begin is restraint. At this point, the data is not yet decisive, the concept is not yet sharp enough, and the temptation to overreach is enormous. So we begin with a narrower promise. We are not going to assume that meaningful coincidence reveals a secret code built into reality. We are also not going to assume that every such moment is merely mental static. We are going to test the middle ground. We are going to ask what happens when subjective experience, laboratory anomalies, quantum theory, and older philosophical frameworks are placed in the same room and forced to face one another. So before going further, leave one comment with the single coincidence in your life that felt least reducible to chance. Not the strangest, the hardest to dismiss. Because the next step is to separate the events that only feel large from the few that might deserve a deeper kind of attention. And once that separation begins, the problem stops being emotional. It becomes structural. Part 2. The easiest way to make this entire subject disappear is to say one sentence and say it quickly. The brain sees patterns in randomness. That sentence is not false. In many cases, it is the correct explanation. But it often functions less like an explanation than like a curtain. It closes the discussion before the difficult part begins. Because once we admit that the mind is vulnerable to false patterns, we still have to ask a second question. How strong is that vulnerability exactly? Strong enough to explain some cases, strong enough to explain most cases, but is it strong enough to explain all of them? That is the point where dismissal stops being science and starts becoming habit. Confirmation bias is the most common tool used to settle the issue. We remember the hits and forget the misses. We think of many people during a week, but we only notice the one who actually calls. We dream many dreams, but we only remember the one that seems to match the next day. We assign importance after the fact. We edit memory in ways that flatter coherence. All of this is real. It has been shown again and again in psychology. The mind is not a neutral recording device. It is selective. It compresses, it reconstructs. It bends experience toward narrative because narrative is easier to carry than raw contingency. There is also apophenia. That is the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. A face in the clouds, a secret message in a random sequence, patterns in stock prices, a prophecy in noise. The mechanism is ordinary and ancient. The world delivers more information than the nervous system can calmly absorb, so the mind reduces chaos by grouping fragments into recognizable shapes. Once that tendency is in place, meaning can spread very fast. One coincidence attracts another. One noticed number suddenly appears everywhere. Attention becomes a magnet, and the more emotionally charged the situation, the stronger the effect tends to be. That is important because an emotional need can function like a lens. When someone is grieving, uncertain, lonely, or desperate for direction, the threshold for perceived significance becomes lower. Events that would have been ignored in a stable week begin to glow. A song lyric, a timestamp, a phrase overheard in a shop, an unusual animal crossing the road. The outer event may be ordinary. The inner condition changes its weight. In that sense, meaning is not always found. Very often, it is supplied. Not dishonestly, not consciously, but supplied all the same by a mind trying to orient itself inside pressure. This is the sober foundation any serious inquiry has to keep. Otherwise, the subject becomes unusable. If every vivid coincidence is treated as revelation, then error becomes infinite. A person can trap themselves inside a hall of mirrors built from their own hunger for significance. Conspiracy thinking often grows in exactly this soil. The pattern detector overheats. Every fragment starts pointing everywhere. The world feels charged. Everything connects. And once everything connects, nothing can be tested. That is not depth, it is the collapse of standards. So the correction must be sharp. Most apparent synchronicities are probably not windows into the fabric of reality. They are products of selection, memory, expectation, and emotional salience. That statement is not cynical. It is disciplined. It protects the inquiry from inflation. It keeps us from mistaking intensity for truth. If this video did not say that clearly it would fail before it began, but now the harder move, even after granting all of that, something remains. The ordinary skeptical toolkit explains a large domain of experience, but it does not automatically settle cases where three elements converge with unusual precision: exact timing, high specificity, direct personal relevance. Those three together create the pressure point. A coincidence becomes more difficult to dismiss when it is not vague, not broad, not retrofitted, but sharply fitted to a psychological situation in a way that feels statistically narrow. The brain may still be overreading, of course it may, but the burden of explanation starts to rise. Imagine a fisherman casting a net into the sea. Most of what the net catches is predictable: driftwood, small fish, trash, fragments. If one day the net pulls up an object shaped uncannily like a key to a locked door you have been carrying for years, skepticism is still appropriate. But skepticism now has to work harder than before, not because the impossible has been proven, because the coincidence has acquired contour. It now asks not only whether a mind can invent meaning, but whether randomness always produces forms that fit human crises so cleanly. This is where raw probability enters, and also where probability often misleads. Human beings are bad at large numbers. In a world with billions of people, millions of daily interactions, and an endless stream of thoughts, many astonishing events are bound to happen. A statistical miracle is not rare when the number of trials is enormous. The lottery looks impossible until you remember how many tickets exist. The truly surprising thing is not that somebody wins, it is that we keep experiencing the winner's perspective from the inside of our own lives. That inside view magnifies rarity because it feels personal, and personal rarity is much more convincing than abstract probability. Still, skill cuts both ways. Large numbers explain why weird things happen at all. They do not by themselves explain why some weird things arrive with such concentrated symbolic relevance. A random deck will eventually produce long streaks. That is true, but if the streak seems to answer a question that has not been spoken aloud, we have moved from surprise into interpretation. The event may still be random. That possibility must remain open. Yet the event is now operating on two planes at once. Statistical occurrence on one side, human significance on the other. The trouble is that no simple theory handles both planes equally well. A purely psychological explanation treats the second plane as decoration. The outer event happens, the human mind wraps it in significance afterward. Sometimes that is enough, but sometimes the fit between event and inner condition is so narrow that afterward feels too simple. That does not mean a supernatural claim wins by default. It means the phenomenon has not yet been fully described. There is a difference. The first is lazy drama. The second is an honest admission of unfinished understanding. This distinction matters because modern life trains people into two opposite mistakes. One group overinterprets everything. The other group underinterprets everything. The first sees fate in every shadow. The second treats meaning itself as suspect. But human life is not built only from causes we can diagram. It is also built from salience, memory, symbol, expectation, and decision. Those are not decorations placed on top of reality. They are part of how reality becomes real for a conscious being. So when coincidence enters that field, the event is not merely external anymore. It becomes relational. It exists between world and witness. That relational zone is exactly where the debate becomes difficult to stabilize. Psychology can explain a great deal there, more than many believers want to admit. But psychology may not explain every corner of it. less than many skeptics want to admit. And that is why the subject remains alive. Not because the evidence is already conclusive, it is not, but because the easy explanation solves the weak cases and then pretends it has solved the strongest ones too. So we need a better filter. Not a filter that makes the mystery larger, a filter that makes the category smaller and cleaner. Before asking whether any meaningful coincidences point beyond bias, we have to understand how bias actually works, how much of human pattern detection is error, and where the normal account begins to strain under its own confidence. Only then can we tell whether anything unusual is left on the table, or whether the whole subject dissolves once examined closely enough. The first serious attempt to drag this question out of anecdote and into measurement did not begin in a temple, a therapy room, or a philosophy department. It began in an engineering lab. That detail matters. Because once a subject becomes associated with intuition, symbolism, or private experience, the usual assumption is that it cannot survive contact with instrumentation. Either it remains personal or it evaporates. The laboratory at Princeton tried to test whether that assumption was too confident, not by proving cosmic meaning, not by measuring destiny, by asking a narrower and much colder question. Can human intention produce even a tiny repeatable shift in a physical system that should behave randomly? The device at the center of this work was deceptively simple, a random event generator. In plain terms, an electronic system designed to produce outputs that should not lean in one direction over the long run, more like an automated coin flipper than a mystical object. If nothing unusual is happening, the stream balances out. Not perfectly in the short term, because randomness always wanders, but over many trials it should return toward expectation. That is the whole point of using such a device. It gives you a clean baseline. If a deviation appears, and appears often enough. The real challenge is to decide whether the deviation reflects noise-flawed method or something the model did not anticipate. The Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, usually known as PEAR, took that setup and asked participants to sit near the machine and try only by intention to nudge the output slightly high or slightly low. No touching, no hidden switch, no physical intervention in the ordinary sense, just focused intention. The request sounds almost embarrassingly small. Not move the machine, not make lights flash, not suspend gravity, shift the output by a fraction, barely at all. That modesty is one reason the work still matters. The claim was not built around spectacle, it was built around statistical persistence. This is where intuition usually fails. Most people imagine that if something real is happening, it should be obvious at human scale. It should be dramatic, immediate, visible in one sitting. But many real effects in science do not look like that. A weak signal can still be real if it survives large numbers, careful controls, and long time spans. One grain of sand does not tell you much about a desert. A single pulse on a graph may mean nothing. But if a tiny lean keeps returning across years of trials, the question changes. The issue is no longer whether the effect feels impressive. The issue is whether chance alone is still a satisfying account. PEAR reported that the effect, if described conservatively, was small, very small. That point should not be hidden. The average deviation was not the kind that overturns a table. It was more like the faint bending of a needle that should have stayed centered. Critics seized on that, and reasonably so. Small effects are fragile. They are vulnerable to unnoticed bias, selective reporting, and subtle methodological drift. That is one reason this work remains controversial. A tiny anomaly can be either the first crack in a model or the first sign of an experimental illusion. Both possibilities have to stay alive at once, but the reason the lab attracted attention is that the signal did not appear as a single dramatic fluke. It was reported across many trials, many operators, and long stretches of time. The claim was not that one extraordinary subject bent the machine with superhuman force. The claim was stranger and quieter. Ordinary people under ordinary conditions seemed capable of producing a minute but recurring departure from expectation. If true, that would matter precisely because it is modest. A slight effect reliably present can be more disruptive to an established worldview than a spectacular one-off that no one can reproduce. There is a lesson here about skill. We are used to judging importance by visible magnitude. Tidal wave matters. A tremor does not. A star exploding matters. A faint drift does not. But some of the deepest shifts in science began as almost invisible discrepancies. Mercury's orbit did not scream that Newton was wrong. The photoelectric effect did not look large enough to rewrite physics. Background radiation did not look like a dramatic object, it looked like a hiss. In other words, the size of an anomaly and the size of its implications are not the same thing. Still, this is exactly where honesty has to become sharper, not softer. PEAR did not prove that mind creates reality in some sweeping metaphysical sense. It did not prove Jung's concept of synchronicity. It did not prove that meaning governs matter. Those are leaps, and too many discussions make them too quickly. At most, the work posed a controlled question and reported a stubbornly small irregularity. That is the proper scale of the claim. If we enlarge it too soon, the subject turns into theatre. If we shrink it too quickly, it turns into dogma of another kind. The deeper tension is methodological. How do you interpret a weak but persistent deviation in a system built to average out randomness? One interpretation says the effect is statistical dust. Given enough trials, enough flexibility in analysis, and enough desire to see something, an apparent signal can emerge from noise. This is not paranoia. It is a real danger in every data-rich field. Another interpretation says that if the deviation keeps returning under controlled conditions, dismissal becomes less scientific than the original question. At that point, skepticism remains necessary, but it has to become constructive. It has to identify the mechanism of error, not merely repeat that the result should not exist. That last point is crucial. Sometimes science protects itself by demanding rigor. Sometimes it protects itself by defending habit. Those are not the same thing. If a result violates intuition, the correct response is not immediate belief, but it is also not immediate burial. The correct response is replication, refinement, adversarial testing, and narrowing the claim until it breaks or holds. PEAR's defenders argue that this was exactly what the data deserved. Its critics argued that the signal was too small and too vulnerable to subtle artifacts to justify any large conclusion. Both sides touched something true. The data invited interest. The data also invited caution. There is also a limit to observation that has to be stated clearly. A random event generator does not tell us why a deviation occurs, only whether the output departs from expectation. Even if the anomaly is real, the machine cannot tell us whether the cause is intention-attention, emotional state experimenter effects, or some unnoticed coupling between system and environment. The instrument gives a number. The meaning of the number remains underdetermined. That gap between measurement and interpretation is one of the central problems of this entire subject, and yet the image remains powerful. A person sitting still before a machine that should not care they are there. No speech, no touch, no visible force. Only a weak statistical lean that may or may not be real, but refused to disappear simply because the culture around it found it awkward. That is not proof of a hidden order. Not yet, but it is enough to move the discussion out of pure anecdote and into a harsher landscape where private meaning meets instrumentation. Once that meeting happens, the question becomes harder to contain, because if even a tiny opening exists between mind and randomness, then the larger issue is no longer whether strange experiences happen. It is whether consciousness belongs more deeply to the physical world than our standard models have been willing to admit. The next move in this investigation was more radical than it first appears. If a single person sitting beside a random system might produce a tiny statistical lean, then the obvious extension is not to ask whether one gifted individual can do more. It is to ask whether collective attention itself leaves a trace. That shift changes the scale of the problem. We are no longer looking at one mind facing one machine in a quiet room. We are looking at many minds scattered across the planet, passing through the same emotional event at nearly the same time. If any anomaly appears there, the meaning of the question changes. The subject stops looking personal. It starts looking civilizational. This was the premise behind the Global Consciousness Project. The design was simple in outline and strange in implication. Random event generators were placed in multiple locations around the world and left running continuously. Under ordinary conditions, these devices should behave like strangers who never meet. Each system produces its own stream. Each stream wanders independently. Sometimes one leans up while another leans down. Sometimes several drift at once by chance, but over time, there should be no special coherence among them. Independence is the baseline. That is what makes the setup useful. If the network ever begins behaving as though distance matters less than expected, then the anomaly does not belong to one room anymore. It belongs to the map. The core hypothesis was not that tragedy emits a hidden physical field or that celebration releases some undiscovered energy wave. The claim was narrower and harder to classify. During moments of intense shared attention events that pull millions of people into a common emotional frame, the outputs of the devices might become less independent than usual. Not dramatically, not in a way visible to the naked eye, but statistically. A subtle change in correlation, a faint narrowing of randomness. Many separate systems behaving for a brief window as though they had been asked the same question. At first, this sounds almost backward. We are used to thinking of global events as information that travels through media, speech images, and networks. People react because they learn what happened. That part is ordinary, but the machines in this framework are not watching television. They are not reading headlines. They are just running. Binary outputs, quiet streams. The puzzle appears only if their behavior changes at the same time human attention converges. If that happened consistently, the difficult part would not be describing the event. The difficult part would be deciding what kind of connection had even been observed. The case most often discussed was the network response around the attacks of September 11th. According to the project's analyses, the distributed generators showed an unusual deviation from expected randomness during the event window, and in some accounts even before the first impact. That claim is one of the reasons the project remains so controversial. The stronger the timing claim becomes, the harder the interpretive burden grows. If the correlation begins during a globally shocking event, the anomaly is already difficult. If it appears to begin before broad public awareness, then the problem deepens from shared attention to something that starts pressing against ordinary models of time and information. This is exactly where caution has to become severe. It is easy to narrate such data as prophecy. That would be a mistake. The responsible language is narrower. A reported statistical deviation is not the same thing as proof of precognition. A correlation in a selected event window is not the same thing as a discovered law of nature. Once again, the gap between measurement and interpretation is the entire battlefield. Still, even under restraint, the image remains striking. Small devices, isolated and indifferent, scattered across countries, all continuing their blind digital drift while human attention gathers around a rupture in history. The claim is not that the machines understood the event. The claim is that they may have reflected in some weak formal sense the global concentration around it. Other events were also examined. Natural disasters, mass meditations, ceremonies watched by large populations, public deaths that seem to pull millions of people into the same emotional field. The pattern reported by advocates of the project was not that every important event produced an anomaly. That would almost be easier to reject. The pattern was more selective. Events with strong emotional coherence appeared more likely to coincide with departures from expectation than events that were large in an administrative or geopolitical sense, but thin in shared feeling. This is a crucial contrast. It suggests if the signal is real at all, that magnitude alone is not the deciding variable. Meaning may matter more than scale. That is a dangerous sentence, so it needs immediate correction. Meaning here does not mean cosmic purpose. It does not mean the universe has chosen a side in human affairs. It means only that the human layer of relevance, grief, fear, awe, attention, might correlate more strongly with the reported anomaly than the sheer objective size of an event. A technical treaty can affect millions and produce little immediate psychological unity. A single disaster can freeze the attention of the world. If the devices respond more to the second kind of moment than what is being tracked, assuming anything is being tracked is not just news, it is coherence. Coherence is an important word because it translates the idea into a more disciplined frame. Instead of speaking loosely about collective soul or planetary feeling, coherence asks whether many minds can under certain pressures enter a partially shared state strong enough to coincide with measurable deviations in systems built to remain separate. That is still a radical possibility, but it is a cleaner one. It gives the imagination less room to inflate. It also gives criticism a more precise target, and criticism is not optional here. The project has been challenged on multiple grounds. Event selection can be biased. Statistical analysis can drift towards significance when enough windows are tested. Global events are messy. Hardware and environmental factors are difficult to rule out absolutely. Retrospective framing is always a danger. These objections do not automatically destroy the findings, but they do prevent any honest person from speaking as though the case were closed. It is not closed. It remains suspended between provocation and ambiguity. That suspension is exactly what gives the project its force. It does not offer a settled discovery. It offers an unnerving possibility that large groups of human beings, when drawn into a common emotional moment, may not be fully separate in the way our everyday model assumes. The model of isolated minds inside isolated bodies may work well for most practical purposes, just as classical physics works well for bridges and engines. But under unusual conditions, another layer might begin to show through. Weakly, briefly, statistically, not enough to end debate, or enough to keep it open. And that changes the tone of the inquiry. We are no longer asking only whether one person can impose a trace of intention on a machine. We're asking whether reality itself becomes slightly less fragmented when human attention converges at scale. If that sounds too large good, it should, because the proper response is neither belief nor ridicule. It is pressure. More pressure on methods, more pressure on assumptions, more pressure on the idea that consciousness is always local, sealed, and physically irrelevant. Once the question reaches this scale, the laboratory is no longer a room, it is the planet. And the next problem is even harder. Whether the real conflict here is with the data, or with the picture of reality we have become too comfortable to question. This is the point where the subject either becomes honest or collapses into advocacy. Because once the laboratory claims are on the table, the next obligation is not to make them sound larger. It is to make them harder to hide from criticism. That is the real test. Not whether an idea feels expansive, whether it can survive the part of inquiry that strips away comfort, enthusiasm, and selective attention. A phenomenon becomes serious only when it remains visible after the excitement has been removed. And in this field, that removal is brutal. The first thing that has to be said is simple. The effect sizes being discussed are generally small. Not just small in the ordinary sense. Small in the technical sense that they can sit dangerously close to the boundary between a real weak signal and a statistical mirage. That matters because science is not only vulnerable to false negatives, it is also vulnerable to false positives that survive for years when methods are flexible enough. A tiny anomaly can look persuasive if enough analyses are tried, enough windows are examined, and enough negative outcomes disappear into filing cabinets. That is not a special flaw of consciousness research. It is a general vulnerability of modern research culture. So the skeptical case begins with method, not mockery. Were the experiments pre-registered? Were the event windows chosen in advance? Were failed runs reported as faithfully as successful ones? Were statistical corrections applied properly when many comparisons were made? Could subtle experimenter effects leak into the system? Could software decisions nudge the final outcome without anyone acting dishonestly? These questions are not hostile, they are the price of seriousness. And fields that cannot tolerate them usually do not deserve confidence. This is especially important with projects like PEAR and the Global Consciousness Project. Their defenders often emphasize long time spans, large cumulative data sets, and open protocols. The reference text leans heavily on that defense, arguing that the statistical patterns were strong and that mainstream science mostly looked away because the implications were awkward rather than because the methods were weak. That is one interpretation, but it is not the only one. Another interpretation is that extraordinary claims built on weak effects demand even harsher filters than ordinary science usually applies, and many critics believe those filters have not been met consistently enough. That tension is not cosmetic, it changes everything. If a result is large and direct, the burden is distributed differently. A strong effect can survive some messiness. A weak effect cannot. When the signal is tiny, every analytical choice matters. Every exclusion rule matters. Every change in protocol matters. In a situation like that, confidence should rise slowly, not dramatically. A whisper can still be real, but the quieter the whisper, the more disciplined the room has to become. Darrell Bem's precognition experiments are a perfect example of this pressure. In the reference text, they are presented as a major rupture. Participants appeared to perform slightly above chance on tasks where the random outcome was assigned after their choice, and later replication attempts were described as mixed rather than decisively negative. The text also points to a later meta-analysis that reported a small overall effect across many studies. This is exactly the kind of result that divides a field. Supporters see a faint but persistent pattern. Critics see a domain where publication bias, optional stopping, and analytic flexibility can manufacture the appearance of significance without any new law of nature being present. Both reactions have some force, that is what makes the case difficult. A failed large replication does not necessarily erase every positive result. A positive meta-analysis does not necessarily prove the underlying phenomenon is real. Meta-analysis is powerful, but it can also become a machine for averaging structured error. If the source studies are biased in related ways, combining them can make the illusion look cleaner rather than exposing it. On the other hand, when small effects recur across different labs and designs, total dismissal can also become too easy. It begins to look less like rigor and more like philosophical discomfort. This is where a major correction is needed. Too many people think the argument has only two positions. Either these experiments reveal a profound new layer of reality, or they are worthless. That is a false binary. A field can be suggestive without being decisive. A body of results can be intriguing without being secure. A pattern can deserve further attention while still failing to justify the metaphysical conclusions often built on top of it. In fact, most of the intellectual damage in this area comes from skipping that middle category. The uploaded text does skip it at times. It moves from small anomalies to sweeping statements about meaning being woven into reality, and it often treats criticism as resistance to implications rather than as a live methodological concern. That move is rhetorically powerful, but it is exactly where caution should tighten. A controversial statistical pattern is not yet a license to redraw ontology. You do not earn a new universe from a suggestive p-value. You earn at most the right to keep asking better questions. There is also a limit of interpretation that no one should ignore. Even if we grant for a moment that some of these anomalies are real, the data would still underdetermine the explanation. Suppose a random network deviates during major collective events. What exactly would that show? Shared attention affecting physical systems, hidden environmental coupling not yet identified, flaws in event selection, some unknown property of data aggregation. The number alone does not decide among these. Measurement is not self-interpreting. A graph does not arrive with its own philosophy attached. That is why the strongest stance here is neither belief nor contempt. It is calibrated uncertainty. The strongest stance says some reported results in this domain are difficult enough that they should not be waved away lazily. At the same time, the present evidence does not justify speaking as though consciousness has already been shown to transcend conventional causal structure. That sentence may sound cautious. It is. But it is also sharper than either extreme. It protects against inflation from one side and dismissal from the other, and this is the real consequence of the controversy. It forces the category of synchronicity to become smaller, cleaner, and more expensive. Not every coincidence qualifies. Not every anomaly deserves interpretation. Not every positive study survives contact with replication. But not every uncomfortable result should be buried under the phrase pattern-seeking brain either. The field remains suspended because neither side has fully earned the right to speak with finality. That suspension is not a weakness in the story. It is the hinge, because once the empirical record becomes unstable in this specific way, the next step is unavoidable. We have to ask whether the difficulty lies only in the data, or whether part of the difficulty lies in the classical picture of reality we keep using to judge the data in the first place. And that question leads straight into quantum theory, where the word impossible has already had to be revised more than once. The reason quantum theory enters this story is not that it gives permission for every strange human experience to become profound. It does not. The reason it matters is more disciplined than that. Classical intuition says the world is built from separate things that influence one another through local chains. One object touches another. One signal travels from here to there, one cause produces one effect across a traceable bridge. That picture works so well at ordinary scale that it became almost invisible. It felt less like a model than like common sense itself. Quantum physics is where that confidence began to fracture, and once it fractured, the word impossible had to be used more carefully. The turning point began with a problem Einstein hated. In the reference text, the story is framed through the 1935 paper by Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen. Their argument was meant as an objection, not a celebration. If quantum mechanics was taken literally, Then two particles that had once interacted could later be separated by great distance and still display linked outcomes when measured. Einstein mocked the implication as spooky action at a distance, because he believed no acceptable physics could allow such a thing. The insult mattered. It showed how deeply the idea violated the structure of thought physics had relied on for centuries. At first, this can sound like a magician's trick, so it has to be cleaned up. Entanglement does not mean one particle sends a secret message through empty space in the usual sense. It means the pair must be described as a single system in a way classical intuition does not like. Measure one side and the statistical structure governing the other side is immediately constrained. That does not feel natural because our instincts are built from chairs, stones, weather, and to bodies. They are not built from the microphysical world. Quantum theory is hard not because it is poetic. It is hard because reality at that scale is less separable than our minds expect. John Bell turned this discomfort into mathematics. According to the reference text, Bell's theorem showed that if quantum predictions are right, then no theory built from local hidden variables can reproduce the observed correlations. In plainer language, Einstein's hope for a deeper local explanation runs into a wall. Bell derived an inequality that any world obeying both locality and realism should satisfy, and quantum mechanics predicted violations of that limit. That is one of the great moments in modern science. A philosophical argument stopped being only philosophical. It became experimentally vulnerable. The early tests mattered, but the later ones changed the tone. The reference text points to the 1972 Clauser and Friedman experiment, then the much sharper work of Alain Aspect in the early 1980s, where measurement settings were switched so quickly that no light-speed signal could plausibly coordinate the distant outcomes during the flight of the particles. The correlation still persisted. Then came the 2015 loophole-free Bell tests, including Delft, Vienna and NIST, designed to close the main escape routes that skeptics had relied on for decades. The text also notes the 2022 Nobel Prize to Aspect, Clauser and Zeilinger for work establishing the violation of Bell inequalities and advancing quantum information science. This is the first major award of the section. Non-local correlation is not a fringe metaphor, it is part of mainstream physics. That sentence has to be stated plainly because too much bad writing has done damage on both sides. One side tries to use quantum language as a free pass for any mystery. The other side reacts by pretending quantum weirdness never leaves the lab. Neither is good enough. The real point is narrower and stronger. Physics has already demonstrated that the world is not fully describable as a collection of separate local parts whose properties are all settled in advance independent of measurement. That is not spiritual language. That is what the experiments forced modern theory to live with. The correction of intuition here is severe. Most people imagine the shock in quantum theory as uncertainty. But uncertainty is not the deepest wound. The deeper wound is relation. The fact that what happens here cannot always be thought cleanly apart from what is set up there. The world, at least in the domain described by entanglement, is less like a box of marbles and more like a pattern stretched across distance. Pull one corner and the whole configuration changes what can be said about the rest. That does not mean the universe is magical. It means separateness was a stronger assumption than reality was willing to support. Still, this is exactly where discipline must tighten again. Quantum non-locality does not prove synchronicity in the Jungian sense. It does not prove that a dream, a phone call, and a symbolic coincidence in a human life are physically the same kind of event as entangled particles in a Bell test. Anyone who makes that leap too quickly is smuggling poetry in as evidence. The reference text itself pushes hard toward the comparison, saying that quantum theory reveals a causal connections and asking whether synchronicity might belong to the same family. That is a legitimate question. It is not a settled answer. Why does that distinction matter so much? Because scale matters. A pair of entangled photons in a carefully prepared experiment is not the same thing as a human mind embedded in a warm, noisy, biological environment. Decoherence becomes relevant here. The text itself acknowledges that entanglement becomes far harder to observe in warm macroscopic systems, even if it does not simply vanish in principle. This is the limit of observation that must be stated calmly. Physics has shown that non-local correlations exist. It has not shown that the patterns of an ordinary human life can be straightforwardly mapped onto that structure. And yet the consequence remains large. Once physics itself admits that not all real connections travel through the old local picture, the philosophical landscape changes. We lose the right to say with absolute confidence that any meaningful linkage lacking an obvious mechanism must therefore be unreal. We do not gain the right to call it true, but we do lose the old reflex that mechanism is the only admissible form of order. That is a smaller claim than many people want. It's also a more important one, because it changes the standard of dismissal. Imagine looking at a tapestry from the back. You see threads entering and disappearing. You assume each visible crossing is accidental because you cannot yet see the image on the front. Quantum theory does not tell us what the front image is. It does something subtler. It proves that the backside is less disconnected than it seemed. Some threads that looked separate are not separate in the deeper description. That is the opening, not the conclusion. So this section leaves us in a deliberately uncomfortable place. The physics is real. The temptation to overextend it is also real. Quantum theory has already broken the classical belief that all lawful connection must be local, mechanical, and intuitively separable. But it has not yet built a bridge from Bell-test entanglement to the meaningful coincidences of human experience. That bridge, if it exists at all, would require another layer of argument. And that is exactly where the next part has to go. Not into mysticism by reflex, but into the hardest question now available, whether the resemblance between quantum connection and synchronicity is only suggestive, or whether it points toward a deeper framework we still do not know how to describe. This is the point where the argument usually breaks, not because quantum physics becomes less interesting, but because people start asking it to do work it has not earned. Once entanglement enters the story, the temptation is immediate. If particles can be linked across distance, then perhaps thoughts, dreams, symbols, and human lives are linked the same way. It is an attractive leap. It feels elegant, it also moves faster than the evidence. And this section matters because the correctability of everything around it depends on whether that leap is resisted or indulged. The first limit is scale. A Bell test involves highly controlled systems prepared under specific conditions. Entangled particles are isolated as carefully as possible. Measurements are designed with brutal precision. Noise is the enemy, temperature matters, timing matters, detector efficiency matters. Every unwanted interaction threatens to wash out the pattern. Human life is the opposite of that environment. A human being is not a clean experimental system. A brain is warm wet, metabolically active, chemically crowded, and continuously entangled with a body that is itself entangled with a turbulent world. That does not make human experience uninteresting. It makes simple transfer from microphysics to psychology extremely difficult. This is where decoherence becomes important. The reference text itself makes the point in a way worth keeping. Entanglement may persist in principle as part of the universe's quantum state, but decoherence reduces its practical observability in warm, noisy environments. That sentence changes the whole tone of the discussion. It means one cannot simply say everything is entangled, therefore synchronicity is explained. The first half of that statement may gesture toward a real physical picture. The second half does not follow automatically. Persistence in principle is not the same thing as usable structure in a human-scale setting. A signal can exist and still be inaccessible. A thread can remain in the fabric and still be impossible to pull on. The second limit is category. Quantum correlation is not the same thing as meaning. This distinction has to stay sharp. In a Bell experiment, the correlation is formal. It is expressed in measurement statistics. It does not arrive already loaded with personal relevance, symbolic density, or psychological timing. A synchronistic event, by contrast, is defined precisely by that relevance. It is not merely unlikely, it matters to the person inside it. That means even if one day a deeper framework links the two domains, the translation will not be trivial. You would still need an account of how physical correlation becomes lived significance. Physics can describe constraint. Human experience adds salience. Those are not interchangeable words. This is where weak writing usually fails. It takes the phrase "a causal connection" from quantum theory and lays it directly over Jung's idea of meaningful coincidence, as if the overlap in language were enough to prove sameness in structure. The uploaded reference text pushes close to that move more than once, suggesting that synchronicity may be the experiential face of quantum non-locality. That is a provocative hypothesis. It is not a demonstrated result. The resemblance is real enough to study. It is not yet strong enough to settle the matter. The third limit is its explanatory reach. Suppose you grant, for argument's sake, that classical separateness is not the whole story. Suppose you also grant that consciousness research has produced a few anomalies not yet fully digested. Even then, a bridge theory is still missing. A bridge theory would have to do much more than say everything is connected. It would have to specify under what conditions meaningful correlations arise, why some inner states seem to align with outer events while others do not, how such alignments could be measured independently of anecdote, and why symbolic relevance would cluster around specific lives and decisions rather than appearing as a uniform haze. Without that bridge, the language of connection stays suggestive but underpowered. That missing bridge matters because human beings are excellent at mistaking metaphors for mechanisms. A tapestry is a powerful image, a web is a powerful image, a hologram is a powerful image. These images may help us feel the shape of a problem. They do not solve it. The fact that a metaphor is beautiful or even structurally illuminating does not mean it has become a testable account of nature. This is the difference between philosophical fertility and scientific sufficiency. The first may be present, the second has not yet been earned. Now the correction that cuts the other way. Admitting these limits does not force us back into crude dismissal. It does not restore the old certainty that only local mechanical chains are real. Quantum theory already took that certainty away. What the limits do is smaller and more useful. They tell us where the line currently stands. On one side, entanglement is proven in controlled physics. On the other side, meaningful coincidence in human life remains an open interpretive problem. Between them lies a conceptual corridor, not yet a completed bridge. That is a more modest picture than believers want. It is also a less dismissive picture than skeptics usually allow. The visual anchor here should be exact. Imagine two distant mountain peaks visible through fog. From one angle they seem close enough to join. From another, a whole valley opens between them. Quantum non-locality is one peak. Human synchronicity is the other. The fog is made of analogy, hope, speculation, and partial data. It would be foolish to declare the peaks identical. It would also be foolish to say the valley is empty before mapping it. The honest work begins by measuring the distance instead of pretending it is already crossed. This is also the point where David Bohm becomes relevant, but only if introduced with restraint. The reference text turns toward Bohm's implicate order, precisely because ordinary quantum language does not yet give a satisfying account of how separated events might belong to a deeper whole. Bohm offers a framework in which separation, at the visible level, may conceal a deeper enfolded structure. That framework is philosophically rich. It may even help explain why the comparison between entanglement and synchronicity keeps returning. But it enters as a speculative architecture, not as established experimental closure. The reference text itself says this clearly at one crucial point. The stronger holographic interpretation of consciousness remains speculative and unproven. That admission is not a weakness. It is the condition for thinking clearly. Science has not proven that synchronicity is real in the same way entanglement is real. The uploaded text says that directly near its conclusion, and on this point, it is exactly right. The laboratory anomalies may suggest that something unusual is happening. Quantum non-locality has solid experimental grounding, but the final synthesis, the claim that meaningful coincidences in human life are manifestations of quantum non-locality operating through some deeper order, has not yet been achieved. So this section leaves us with a necessary discipline. The world may be less separate than classical thought assumed, but less separate is not the same as fully interpreted. We now have a more exact boundary. Quantum theory opens the door. It does not walk us through it. If we want a framework that speaks not only about correlation but about meaning, not only about particles but about the lived texture of events, then the next step cannot come from bell tests alone. It has to come from a deeper model of wholeness. And that is why the next part turns to Bohm, where the question changes from whether connection exists to what kind of reality could hold connection and meaning inside the same structure. If quantum theory showed that separateness is less stable than classical thought assumed, David Bohm tried to ask the next question. What kind of reality would make that unsurprising? That is why his work matters here. Not because it has been experimentally confirmed as the final word. It has not. It matters because it offers a framework in which the resemblance between quantum connectedness and meaningful coincidence stops looking like a loose metaphor and starts looking like a structural possibility. The price of using Bohm, however, is discipline. We have now left the safest ground. The physics that establish Bell violations is mainstream. Bohm's larger vision is not established in the same way. It enters this story as a serious theoretical proposal, not as the settled discovery. Bohm's starting point was already unusual. In the uploaded reference text, he is described as developing an interpretation in which quantum particles have definite positions while being guided by a wave function that acts not like a push but like an information field. The point is subtle. Instead of imagining the particle as a tiny isolated object being kicked around locally, Bohm's picture treats the larger configuration as already present in the guiding structure. The particle does not need a local shove from every relevant factor, because the information about the entire setup is already enfolded in the wave function. This does not magically solve every puzzle, but it shifts the intuition. Reality begins to look less like many separate things interacting from outside, and more like visible pieces emerging from a deeper order that is already whole. That deeper order is Bohm's most important contribution to this discussion. He called it the implicated order. The world we ordinarily live in, the world of distinct objects, separated people, individual events, is what he called the explicate order. It is the unfolded world, the visible surface. The implicate order is deeper. It is the unfolded structure from which the surface world emerges. In the reference text, this is described as a reality in which everything is folded into everything else, and in which apparent separateness belongs mainly to the visible level, not to the deepest one. Bohm's famous image for this is worth lingering on because it does real explanatory work. Imagine a clear cylinder filled with thick fluid. Put a drop of ink into it, then slowly turn the cylinder. The ink stretches, thins, and disappears into the fluid. It is not destroyed, it is distributed. It becomes invisible because it has been folded into a pattern too fine for the eye to track. Turn the cylinder back and the drop reappears. The visible shape returns because the hidden order never vanished. It was encoded all along. The reference text uses exactly this demonstration to distinguish the visible drop from the distributed pattern that contains it. That image gives us a very different way of imagining connection. Not as one event firing a signal at another across empty space, but as two visible moments unfolding from one deeper arrangement. This is where synchronicity enters Bohm's framework. If the implicate order is real, then two events that appear separate in the explicate order may not be separate at the level that matters most. A thought in one mind, a call from a distant friend, a dream, a next-day encounter. At the surface, they look unconnected. No force passes between them. No mechanism can be drawn in ordinary terms, but in an implicate order, that absence of visible mechanism would not settle the matter. They could still be expressions of one enfolded pattern becoming visible at two different points. The uploaded text says this, directly arguing that in such a framework, synchronicity would not be mysterious but expected. That is a powerful proposal. It is also exactly where the line between framework and proof must stay bright. Bohm's idea offers a way to think the problem. It does not by itself demonstrate that any specific coincidence in your life arose from such an order. The difference matters. A map can make a journey thinkable without proving that you have already arrived. Too many accounts of synchronicity fail here. They move from Bohm makes this conceivable to therefore this happened because of Bohm's implicate order. That is not an argument, it is an acceleration. Bohm strengthened the picture further with another visual anchor. The hologram. In a hologram, each fragment contains information about the whole image. Break it into pieces, and each piece still carries the entire picture, though at lower resolution. The uploaded text uses this analogy to make a radical claim. Every region of space may contain information about every other region, and the whole may be distributed through every part. This matters because it changes what separate events might mean. If the whole is present in some form in each part, then coincidence itself may be the wrong category for at least some alignments. Two events can look independent only if we assume the visible level is the whole of reality. Bohm's framework denies that assumption. The reference text then joins Bohm to Karl Pribram's holographic brain hypothesis. Memory in this view is not neatly stored in one tiny location but distributed. From there, the text moves toward a much larger suggestion that the brain may be less like a factory producing consciousness and more like a receiver tuning into a deeper order. This is one of the most provocative moments in the whole source. It is also where the caution label has to be doubled. The text itself admits this is speculative and unproven. That admission should not be softened. Whatever philosophical fertility this model has, it is not established experimental fact that the brain tunes into an implicate cosmic structure the way a radio tunes into a signal. Still, the reason the idea survives is not hard to see. It offers a single architecture for several otherwise disconnected puzzles: distance effects in consciousness experiments, time-displaced intention claims, bonded pairs showing stronger anomalies, meaningful coincidences in lived experience. The uploaded text explicitly says the framework is appealing because it can organize all of these into one pattern. Whether it truly explains them is another matter, but the attraction is real. It gives the mind one deep room instead of many scattered fragments. This is the correction of intuition at the center of the section. We usually imagine explanation as tracing a chain from one visible event to another visible event. Bohm asks us to imagine explanation as the unfolding of what was already jointly present at a deeper level. That is a very different style of causation, or perhaps a move beyond classical causation altogether. It's not automatically true, but once stated clearly, it helps explain why the classical picture has such trouble with synchronicity. The classical picture asks what pushed what Bohm's picture asks. What visible events are partial expressions of one hidden whole. So this part leaves us with a possibility, not a verdict. Bohm gives the story a deeper architecture. He provides a language for wholeness enfoldment and the appearance of separation. He offers a way to think how meaning and correlation might someday belong to one framework. But he does not complete the proof. The implicate order remains a theoretical lens, not an established law of lived synchronicity. And that is why the next step has to return from architecture to the human body itself. If meaning is not only projected, where would the first faint trace appear? Perhaps not in belief, perhaps not in narrative, but in physiology, where reaction may begin before the mind has even found words for what it thinks it knows. If there is any place where this subject becomes harder to dismiss without becoming easier to explain, it is the body. Not belief, not interpretation, not the story as people tell afterward, the body. Because one of the oldest objections to synchronicity is that meaning is always added too late. The event happens first, then memory edits it, emotion colours it, narrative arranges it. What looked uncanny was only ordinary life seen through hindsight. That objection has real force. But it becomes less complete if signs of anticipation appear before conscious interpretation has time to organise them. This is why the physiological experiments matter. They do not ask whether people can tell stories about meaningful coincidence. They ask whether the organism itself reacts to significance before the conscious mind knows what it is reacting to. The reference text turns here to what is often called presentiment. The basic setup is cold and simple. A participant sits before a screen while physiological signals are measured. Skin conductance, heart rhythm, other markers of arousal. Images are then presented in random order. Some are calm, some are emotionally charged. The important point is the timing. The computer selects the next image after the physiological measurement window being analysed. And yet, according to the studies cited in the source, participants often show a small rise in arousal, a few seconds before the emotionally charged image appears. If that result is robust, it creates a very unusual problem. The body seems to respond to a future significance before conscious awareness has anything clear to work with. This is one of the strongest visual anchors in the whole documentary. A person sits still in a dim room. Nothing visible has happened yet. The screen is blank or neutral, but somewhere below language the body has already begun to lean. The pulse shifts, the skin changes, not enough for drama, enough for a graph. That matters because a graph is much harder to romanticize than a diary entry. It does not eliminate interpretation, nothing does. But it changes the level at which the problem has to be faced. Still, the same rule applies here as everywhere else. A provocative result is not the same thing as a settled conclusion. Presentiment studies remain disputed. Small effects are vulnerable. Analytical choices matter. Experimental design matters. Replication matters. A physiological difference observed across many trials can still arise from subtle procedural artifacts if the setup is not extremely tight. The correct response is not awe, it is pressure. Pressure on timing controls, pressure on randomization, pressure on data handling. If a claim touches the direction of causation itself, the burden should become severe. But suppose only for a moment that the core pattern survives that pressure. Suppose the body really does show weak anticipatory responses before an emotionally relevant event selected at random. What would that mean? Not necessarily that the future is already written in a simple deterministic sense, not necessarily that the participant consciously knows what is coming. The reference text is careful on that point. It emphasizes that the participants are not consciously predicting the future, and that the apparent effect is subpersonal, driven by emotional salience rather than deliberate foresight. That distinction matters. We are not talking about a person calmly seeing tomorrow. We are talking about the body behaving as if relevance can reach it before relevance becomes an experience in the ordinary sense. This leads to one of the most important corrections in the entire video. Consciousness may not be one thing, or at least it may not operate at one speed. The reflective mind, the part that narrates reasons, doubts, and explains, may arrive late to processes that begin elsewhere. We already know this in more ordinary ways. The body often reacts before the story catches up. Fear rises before explanation. Attraction forms before justification. Grief lands before language. That does not prove presentiment, but it does make the general structure less alien. The organism is not a courtroom where everything is decided by conscious thought. It is closer to a layered instrument, and some layers may be listening before others know a signal is present. The source text uses this point to connect presentiment to the larger issue of synchronicity. If the body can respond to future emotional significance in a weak but measurable way, then meaning may not always be something added after the fact. It may in some cases be part of the event structure itself. That is a large inference, and it has to be labelled as one. The experiments do not prove that every meaningful coincidence carries a hidden anticipatory physiology. They do not prove that symbols in a life are governed by retrocausal laws. What they do at most is loosen the old confidence that temporal order is experienced only in one clean direction by every layer of the human organism. There is also a harder limit here that the script has to state clearly. Even if presentiment effects are real, they would still be weak and statistical. They would not give us a practical oracle. They would not tell a person which decision to make. They would not separate truth from delusion in everyday life. This matters because the imagination always wants to turn subtle anomalies into usable magic. The data does not support that. A slight anticipatory lean in aggregate measurements is not the same thing as a reliable method for navigating the future. The body might whisper before the mind understands. That is very different from saying it can speak clearly on command, and yet the philosophical consequence remains serious. If anticipation exists below awareness, then the division between inner event and outer event begins to soften in a new way. The body is no longer just reacting to what has already arrived. It becomes a boundary zone, a place where time relevance and physiology may intersect before conscious interpretation organizes them into a story that does not solve synchronicity, but it changes where we look for its first trace, not in grand revelation, in subtle preparation, not in supernatural certainty, in a measurable hesitation of the flesh. This is why the body matters more than belief in this part of the argument. Belief is easy to fake, easy to bias, easy to contaminate with desire. Physiology is not immune to error, but it is less theatrical. It gives us a more stubborn surface to work with. If meaningful alignment has any empirical foothold at all, one plausible place to search is where significance first enters the organism before language claims it. The source text pushes this strongly, treating presentiment as evidence that information may not move only from past to future in the classical way. That is not yet settled science. But it is serious enough that dismissal now requires more than a shrug. So the map has changed again. We began with anecdote. We moved to random systems, collective attention, quantum non-locality, and a speculative model of hidden order. Now we have arrived at the organism itself, where meaning may leave a trace before conscious recognition. That does not complete the picture. It opens another gap. Because once the body enters the story, the question is no longer only whether the universe contains hidden structure. It is whether human traditions, long before laboratories were describing ways of inhabiting that structure in the language available to them. And that is where the next section has to go. Long before laboratories began counting deviations in random systems, human traditions were already asking a different version of the same question. What if the visible sequence of events is not the deepest level of reality? What if what looks accidental from the surface belongs at another depth to an order we do not usually perceive? This is where the documentary could become careless. It could turn traditions into props or treat them as if they had secretly discovered quantum mechanics in poetic disguise. That would flatten both science and religion. The stronger approach is narrower. The point is not that ancient contemplatives solved modern physics. The point is that many traditions described a world in which separation is not. Final meaning is not trivial, and coincidence may conceal a deeper pattern. The resemblance is structural, not identical, and that is enough to make it worth examining. Christianity gives that hidden order a name: providence. In the uploaded text, providence is described not as a vague comfort, but as a precise claim that events participate in an order larger than human sight. Augustine's picture is especially important because it changes the scale of time itself. If all of time is simultaneously present to the divine perspective, then what looks random from within time may appear coherent from outside it. Thomas Aquinas extends this by arguing that divine providence reaches even to events that seem contingent or accidental. What we call coincidence in this frame may reflect the limits of our perspective rather than a lack of order in reality. That does not prove synchronicity, but it gives us a disciplined theological version of the idea that visible causes may not exhaust the structure of an event. The correction of intuition here is important. Modern people often hear providence and imagine a crude supernatural hand interrupting ordinary life from the outside. The older Christian picture in the source text is subtler. The visible chain of events still exists. Causes still operate, stones still fall, people still choose, but the visible chain does not stand alone. It belongs to a deeper ordering principle. That matters because it parallels the distinction we have already developed between surface sequence and hidden structure. Not the same doctrine, not the same method, but a similar architecture. A visible order of mechanisms and a deeper order in which the mechanisms may be coordinated into meaning. Buddhism arrives from another direction and lands on a similarly destabilizing conclusion. The reference text centers dependent origination, the claim that nothing arises independently. Every event, object, thought, and moment of consciousness emerges through conditions, and those conditions emerge through further conditions in an open web extending through space and time. This matters because it attacks one of the strongest habits of ordinary thought. We imagine things as self-contained, a person, a choice, a coincidence, a life. Buddhism says this is already a distortion. The event you isolate never really stood alone. It only looked that way because your perception cuts the web into manageable pieces. The source text then moves to one of the most powerful visual anchors in all contemplative literature, Indra's net, an infinite network of jewels, each reflecting every other jewel, each reflection containing the reflections of all the others. That image matters for the documentary because it translates an abstract claim into something immediately graspable. The world is not a row of sealed beads on a string. It is a reflective mesh where each point contains traces of the whole. Again, that is not proof that every meaningful coincidence is ontologically deep. But it is a very old and very precise way of saying that apparent separateness may be a practical illusion. Hindu thought adds another layer. The uploaded text speaks of Brahman as the underlying reality from which phenomena arise, and of Maya as the illusion of separateness that conceals unity. It also points to the Bhagavad Gita's claim that the wise see the same self in all beings, and all beings in the same self. That is not a statistical argument, it is a metaphysical one, but the documentary has to notice what kind of metaphysics it is. It does not merely say the world is spiritually connected in a vague emotional sense. It says the boundary between individual existence and total reality is less final than it appears. If that were even partly true, then meaningful alignment would not be an exception pasted onto the world. It would be a natural consequence of a world whose apparent fragments already belong to one ground. Daoism may be the most elegant of the group because it frames the issue through flow rather than doctrine. In the source text, the Tao is described as a hidden order that does not force events but allows them to unfold. Wu Wei, often translated as effortless action, is not passivity. It is alignment with a pattern deeper than deliberate control. The examples are concrete and beautiful. The cook whose knife does not dull because he follows the grain already present. The swimmer who rides the current rather than fighting it. These are not merely lessons in skill, they are images of a human being learning to move with reality, instead of imposing a separate will upon it. In that framework, synchronicity would not look like an interruption of order. It would look like a moment when you stop resisting the order already there. This is the point where the uploaded text makes its boldest claim. It says the convergence across traditions is structural. Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Daoism all suggest three things. First, the visible world of separate events is not the deepest level. Second, the hidden level connects by meaning, not only by mechanism. Third, human beings can learn to perceive this order through prayer, meditation, contemplation, or alignment. That is a strong synthesis, and it is rhetorically powerful. But here again, the documentary has to keep the labeling clear. This is a cross-traditional interpretation, not an experimentally established result. It is a pattern in testimony, not a proof in the scientific sense. Still, testimony on this scale has weight of its own kind, not the weight of a Bell test, not the weight of a physiological graph, but the weight of repeated human observation refined over centuries. That does not make it infallible. It does make it difficult to dismiss as mere decoration. Entire civilizations kept returning to the idea that the surface of events conceals a deeper coherence. They gave it different names: providence, dependent origination, Brahman, Tao. Their vocabularies do not collapse into one another, but their structural instinct is surprisingly similar. So this section should end in a carefully balanced place. The traditions do not prove synchronicity as a scientific law. What they do is show that the intuition of hidden order is not an isolated modern fantasy. It is one of the most persistent patterns in human reflection, and now that matters more than it first seemed, because we are no longer comparing isolated anecdotes to old belief systems. We are comparing three domains at once: contested empirical anomalies, proven non-locality in physics, and a vast body of contemplative testimony about hidden structure. The next step is unavoidable. We have to place those three lines beside one another and ask the hardest question yet. Not whether any one of them is sufficient alone, but what kind of universe they begin to suggest when taken together. By this point, the question is no longer whether strange coincidences happen. They do. The question is no longer whether quantum theory contains forms of connection that violate classical intuition. It does. The question is no longer whether human traditions have repeatedly described a hidden order beneath visible events. They have. The real question now is more dangerous than all of those combined. What kind of universe could contain all three at once without collapsing into either superstition or reductionism? That is the stake. Because if meaningful alignment is even partly real, then the cost is not a minor adjustment at the edge of psychology. The cost is a revision in how we think about time causation information and the role of consciousness in the structure of reality. Start with time. Classical intuition treats time as a one-way corridor. The past produces the present produces the future. That model is not useless, it is how most of ordinary life remains navigable. But the reference text presses a harder possibility. It draws together delayed choice thinking, retrocausal interpretations, presentiment research, and block universe-style reasoning to suggest that the boundary between before and after may be less absolute than common sense assumes. This should not be overstated. The strongest version of retrocausality has not settled science for human experience, but once physics itself has made time less simple than it first appeared, we lose the right to treat every anticipation-like event as conceptually impossible. That is a major shift, not proof, but permission to think beyond the old corridor. The visual anchor here is simple. We imagine ourselves walking across a bridge one plank at a time, believing only the plank underfoot is real. But a deeper view may resemble a completed structure seen from above. Past, present, and future are not being built as we move. They are already there in some larger geometry. The source text pushes this image strongly, especially when it links synchronistic experience to a reality in which separated moments may be adjacent in a deeper frame, rather than connected only by linear cause. If that is even partly true, then some of the force of synchronicity comes from geometry rather than magic. A future event and a present intuition may feel far apart from inside time, while being structurally near from outside our ordinary perspective. Then causation begins to wobble. Not disappear. Wobble. This distinction matters. Nothing in this documentary requires throwing away ordinary cause and effect. Stones still fall, bodies still age, signals still travel. But the uploaded text keeps returning to a sharper claim. Ordinary causation may not be the only ordering principle available in reality. That is where Jung's original discomfort returns in a new form. If some events are connected without local mechanism, and if some weak anticipatory effects survive scrutiny, then the old equation between real and mechanically caused starts to look too narrow. We would not be entering a universe without law, We would be entering a universe whose laws may include forms of correspondence that classical thinking treated as impossible. That shift has a real consequence for how consciousness is framed. In the standard modern picture, consciousness is usually treated as local, private, and downstream. It happens inside brains after physical processes have already done the serious work. The source text challenges that picture repeatedly. It argues, sometimes cautiously and sometimes too boldly, that the anomalies in consciousness research at least raise the possibility that attention, intention, and emotional coherence are not merely passive observers of a finished world. The careful version of that claim is not that mind rules matter. It is that consciousness may belong more deeply to the architecture of events than a purely after-the-fact model allows. That is a smaller claim and a much more defensible one. Now scale becomes important again. The shock is not really that a person may have an uncanny experience. The shock is what such a possibility would demand at the level of worldview. If meaning is not always projected after the fact, then meaning itself may be structurally real in at least some cases. The source text takes that possibility and pushes it toward quantum information theory, especially through Wheeler's It from Bitline and the idea that information may be more fundamental than matter in the older mechanistic sense. This is exactly where caution and boldness have to travel together. Information may indeed be central to modern physics, but the move from information is foundational to meaning. Is foundational remains partly inferential. It is suggestive. It is not complete. Even so, the inferential pressure is real. A universe grounded in information looks much less like dead substance and much more like structured relation. That is the paradox at the heart of this part. The more rigorously physics proceeds, the less comfortable the old machine metaphor becomes. The reference text states this directly in one of its most forceful passages, arguing that the universe may be less like a collection of separate objects and more like a web of relations patterns and non-local structures. We should not simply inherit that conclusion in its strongest form, but we should notice what is happening. The farther inquiry goes, the harder it becomes to preserve the idea that reality is fully described by isolated bits of matter, pushing one another around in empty space. This is the real price of the topic. If synchronicity has any truth in it at all, then the human being is no longer a detached spectator watching a random external world from behind the glass of private consciousness. The human being becomes a participant in a layered order. Not all-powerful, not omniscient, but implicated, embedded, exposed to patterns that may exceed deliberate thought. The tradition said this in devotional language. The source text says it in the language of information, non-locality and hidden order. The languages are different. The pressure point is the same. We may be less separate than we thought, but honesty requires the final correction before the conclusion. None of this is settled. The source text itself at its best admits that the full synthesis has not been achieved. The objections remain serious. Confirmation bias remains real. The file drawer problem remains real. The gap between laboratory anomalies and lived coincidence remains real. Science has not proven synchronicity in the way it has proven entanglement. That sentence should not weaken the section. It should strengthen it. Because the most interesting place in any inquiry is often not certainty. It is the line where a framework has begun to fail but the replacement has not yet arrived. And that is where we now stand. On one side, a world of mechanisms that still explains a great deal. On the other, a growing pressure from anomalies physics and contemplative traditions suggesting that mechanism may not be the whole map. The next and final step is not to pretend the mystery is solved. It is to decide what intellectual posture becomes possible once you can no longer fully believe the old picture, but do not yet have the right to claim a new one. That is where the documentary has to end, not with a verdict, with a more exact horizon. What remains after all of this is not a verdict. It is a more disciplined way of standing inside uncertainty. That may sound smaller than a revelation. It is not. It is harder. A revelation gives closure. A disciplined uncertainty gives responsibility. By now, the simplest versions of both sides have failed. It is no longer enough to say that every meaningful coincidence is a private fantasy stitched together by a pattern-hungry brain. It is also no longer enough to say that every startling alignment is proof that the universe is whispering directly to you. The first position is too thin for the strongest cases. The second is too eager for the weakest ones. What survives is narrower but more serious. Some experiences of alignment may be psychologically inflated noise. Some may be structurally deeper than our present models know how to describe. We do not yet have the right to collapse those possibilities into one answer. That is the final correction of intuition. People often imagine truth as a choice between enchantment and disenchantment. Either the world is alive with meaning, or it is blind mechanism. Either coincidence is signal, or coincidence is static. But reality is rarely obligated to honour those clean oppositions. The world may be more structured than reductionism allows without becoming a theatre of messages. Meaning may matter more deeply than modern habit admits without becoming a universal permission slip for superstition. The final intellectual task is not to pick a camp and relax. It is to remain exact where the evidence is exact, restrained, where the evidence is thin and open, where the evidence is genuinely unfinished. That exactness now gives us 4 layers, and the layers should remain separate. First, there are facts that are relatively secure. Human cognition is vulnerable to confirmation bias, selective memory apophenia, and emotional overreading. Quantum physics has established non-local correlations that violate classical intuitions about separateness. Some controversial experimental programs in consciousness research have reported weak but persistent anomalies. These statements do not belong to the same category, but each has its place. Second, there are mainstream interpretations. Most psychologists will explain most apparent synchronicities through cognitive mechanisms. Most physicists will treat quantum non-locality as real, while refusing to connect it directly to meaning in ordinary life. Third, there are disputed zones. Presentiment precognition style effects, large-scale consciousness correlations, and intention effects on random systems remain contested. The debate is not over. Fourth, there are wider hypotheses. Bohm's implicate order. Consciousness is more than a byproduct. Meaning is structurally real. These are fertile ideas. They are not established in the same way Bell test violations are established. That layered map matters because confusion begins whenever one layer borrows the authority of another. A suggestive anomaly is presented as proof. A philosophical framework is presented as data. A religious intuition is presented as a laboratory result. Or the reverse happens. A cognitive bias is treated as if it dissolves all anomalous data by definition. A physical limit is treated as if it invalidates every personal experience. The only way through is to refuse these shortcuts. Keep the layers intact. That does not make the story colder. It makes it stronger. And once the layers are held in place, a strange picture begins to emerge. Not a final doctrine. A picture. The picture is this. Reality may have more than one kind of order. There is the familiar order of mechanisms, forces, bodies, signals, and local causes. That order is real. It remains the foundation of almost everything practical. But there may also be a deeper order of relation pattern and timing that does not always announce itself through the channels our ordinary models expect. The uploaded text pushes this idea in its strongest form, arguing that hidden structure may connect what appear at the surface to be separate events. I would state it more cautiously. The possibility is real enough to examine. It is not real enough to declare finished. The visual anchor for the ending should stay simple. Imagine standing before a night sky that looks empty at first glance. Then slowly a star map fades in. The stars do not move. Your perception changes. Some points remain isolated. Others reveal constellations. Still others only seem connected because your eye wants them to be. The mature response is not to insist that every point belongs to a design. It is also not to insist that design is impossible because projection exists. It is to learn the difference between arbitrary lines and recurrent structure. That is what this entire documentary has really been about. And perhaps that is the most honest practical conclusion. Pay attention but do not kneel too quickly. Notice patterns but do not worship them. When a coincidence arrives with unusual force, resist both cheap reactions. Do not inflate it instantly into destiny. Do not flatten it instantly into error. Let it remain unresolved long enough to examine its shape. Ask what is actually specific about it. Ask whether the relevance was present before interpretation or only added after. Ask whether the event clarifies anything or merely excites you. Ask whether it survives distance from the moment. This is not mysticism, it is disciplined attention. Because the real danger of this subject is not that it makes people curious. The real danger is that it tempts people to become careless in one of two directions. One kind of carelessness turns mystery into dogma. The other turns mystery into embarrassment. Both destroy inquiry. The better response is harder and quieter. To let the strongest coincidences remain questioned. To let quantum theory remain strange without making it answer everything. To let traditions remain testimonies without forcing them into premature scientific victory. To let experience matter without granting it absolute authority. If that feels incomplete, it is because the map is incomplete. The uploaded text ends by moving towards certainty, toward the claim that synchronicity is a window into the real structure of the universe, and that the connection was always the truth. It is a powerful ending. But I think the more durable ending is slightly more restrained. Not because the mystery is small, because it is large enough to deserve honesty. Science has not proven that synchronicity is a law of nature in the way entanglement is a feature of modern physics. Yet science also no longer leaves us entirely comfortable with the old reflex that whatever lacks an obvious mechanism must be unreal. Between those two facts, a new intellectual space opens. That space is where we end. Not with certainty, with a better question. Perhaps the deepest issue is never whether the universe is random or meaningful in some total sense. Perhaps the deeper issue is whether our current ways of separating those two categories were too crude from the start. If so, then synchronicity is neither a superstition to be laughed away, nor a doctrine to be preached. It is a pressure point. A place where experience, physics, and contemplation all indicate, in different languages, that the surface of reality may not be the whole of it. And if that is true, then the final lesson is not that the mystery has been solved. It is that the wall between the ordinary and the profound may be thinner than we were taught to believe.